Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where the hidden stories of history come alive. If you enjoy uncovering America's past and the moments that shaped our world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Now, let us begin. The snow in the Ardennes lay heavy that December morning in 1944, thick and muffling, as if the earth itself wanted to hide the violence about to unfold. The trees stood black and skeletal against a pale sky, and from the frozen fields came the grinding, metallic cough of German engines straining to move forward on too little fuel. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, had begun with thunder. Yet behind the roar of artillery and the clanking of panzers lurked a truth too harsh for most German soldiers to face. Their tanks, those steel beasts that once rolled across Europe in triumph, were running on fumes. Colonel Joachim Peiper, a striking figure in his black SS uniform, led one of the most feared armored spearheads of the Wehrkampfgruppe Peiper. At only 29 years old, he was already hardened by years of blood, fire, and loyalty to a regime that promised glory but now delivered only death. His orders were as brutal as they were impossible. Drive deep into American lines, seize the Meuse River crossings, and split the Allies apart. Hitler believed this bold strike could turn the war. But Peiper knew better. Even before his engines roared across the border on December 16th, he had read the fuel calculations. His column of Tigers, Panthers, and armored half-tracks simply did not have the gasoline to reach their objectives. In war, fuel was life. For the Americans, it flowed like a river barrels, tankers, endless convoys rolling from ports in France. For the Germans, it was a trickle, squeezed from synthetic plants, bombed to rubble by Allied aircraft. Men could march hungry, but tanks could not roll thirsty. And as Peiper looked at the fuel gauges dipping lower with every mile, he must have felt the icy hand of fate pressing on his shoulder. This was not the blitzkrieg of 1940. This was desperation. On December 17th, after pushing through scattered American resistance, Peiper's column rolled into a small Belgian village called Hunsfeld. The streets were eerily quiet. Snow crunched under boots. The sharp smell of exhaust mixed with smoke from chimneys, and frightened villagers peered from shuttered windows. German soldiers fanned out, rifles ready. Then came the discovery like a cruel joke from destiny. Hidden behind rows of buildings and barns was an American fuel depot. Drums upon drums stacked high, marked with white stars. Barrels of gasoline, tank trucks half-filled, even maintenance vehicles abandoned in haste by retreating U.S. troops. The tally would later show close to 50,000 gallons of precious American fuel left behind. For German soldiers whose tanks were gasping, it must have seemed like manna from heaven. Men cheered, slapped one another on the back. Some even dipped cups into barrels just to smell the sharp promise of motion. Engines that would have stopped. Cold could now breathe again. And yet, as Peiper surveyed this treasure, a darker thought crept in. He understood what it meant. Here, in one forgotten village, the Americans had abandoned more gasoline than his division had been allocated for an entire offensive. 50,000 gallons, casually left behind, forgotten in retreat. For the Germans, this was unimaginable. Each liter back home was rationed, guarded, stolen from farms, wrung from oil plants working under bombs. Soldiers begged for fuel. Generals quarreled over it. Hitler staked his last hopes on it. And here it was, American fuel, so plentiful that losing it meant nothing to them. Peiper's face, hard and cold in the winter air, must have tightened with realization. He had found fuel, yes, but he had also stumbled upon the truth. Germany could not win, not against this. Not against an enemy who could waste what the right bled for. In the silence of that Belgian village, surrounded by barrels of another nation's strength, Piper saw Germany's fate written clearer than any battle map. The men did not see it that way. They cheered as mechanics refueled tanks and Panthers roared back to life. The engines growled with renewed fury, tracks tearing at the snow. They believed this was a gift, a sign that God or fate still smiled upon their cause. But Piper, the seasoned soldier, knew better. He had fought long enough to sense when luck was an illusion. War is not only won by courage or even tactics. It is won by numbers of men, numbers of guns, numbers of gallons of fuel. The Americans had all of it. Germany had only dreams, and the last breath of a dying machine. To Piper, those barrels at Hansfeld were not salvation, but a mirror showing him how hopeless his mission truly was. Still, there was no turning back. Orders were orders, and he was a soldier bound to carry them out. So Kampfrupp Piper rolled on, fueled by stolen gasoline, deeper into the Ardennes. Behind them, villagers watched silently, knowing more blood was coming. Ahead lay more battles, more villages, and infamy waiting at places like Normandy. Yet in Piper's mind, the image of those barrels lingered, earning like a ghostly vision. They told him what Hitler would never admit, that the war was already lost, and Germany was only marching to its funeral. The column of steel moved forward, grinding through snow and ice, its engines now fed by the captured American fuel. Panthers and tigers, their armored sides streaked with frost and mud, growled like beasts awakened from sleep. The soldiers inside believed they had been given a miracle, but as the tracks clattered over frozen roads, their commander sat in silence. Joachim Piper, eyes fixed ahead, could not shake the thought of those barrels in Hansfeld. 50,000 gallons. Enough to keep his tanks alive for days. Yet to the Americans, it had been nothing. To him, it was everything. To them, it was trash. The Ardennes campaign had been built on illusions. Hitler, in his mountain retreat, had dreamed that one last blow could break the Allies. He imagined his armies splitting the Americans and British apart, storming across the Meuse, perhaps, even reaching Antwerp. He saw a repeat of 1940, the lightning war reborn. But the men who fought in the cold forests knew better. This was not 1940. Germany was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted, bleeding, starving, cornered. The American sky was filled with endless plains when the weather cleared. Their ports brought in supplies that dwarfed anything Germany could imagine. Their factories back home thundered day and night, turning out tanks, rifles, and gallons of gasoline like rivers flowing into the front lines. Fuel shortages had crippled the German army long before this winter gamble. In Normandy that summer, many German tanks sat idle, useless not from allied guns, but from empty fuel tanks. Soldiers had pushed heavy machines by hand just to hide them from bombers. Convoys were ambushed, not for killing, but for siphoning what little petrol they carried. Even officers stole fuel from one another, like starving men fighting over crumbs of bread. And now, here in Belgium, Piper saw the truth carved into the snow. His Kampfrupp had been given just enough fuel to reach the Meuse if everything went perfectly, if no detours, no delays, no resistance slowed them down. That was fantasy. War never went perfectly. Already, hours had been lost in traffic jams, ambushes, lone bridges. Every mile forward drained the tanks dry. Without fuel, his proud spearhead would become nothing but steel coffins sitting frozen in the snow. The American army was different. It did not move by luck or miracle. It moved by planning, by numbers, by a vast machine behind the front lines. For every barrel Piper found in Hansfeld, there were 1,000 more waiting behind American lines. And the numbers told the story better than any speech. America produced nearly 2 billion barrels of oil during the war. Germany, strangled by blockades and bombings, scraped together a tiny fraction of that, barely enough to keep a fraction of its divisions moving. For the Americans, fuel was something to waste, something to leave behind without worry. For the Germans, it was life or death. That imbalance was the war itself. As Piper's column pushed deeper into Belgium, the weather wrapped the land in. Silence. Snow muffled gunfire until it erupted suddenly in brutal clashes. Villages were shattered by tank shells, houses burning, civilians fleeing into the woods with only the clothes on their backs. American troops, young and inexperienced, often fought stubbornly until overrun. Then they surrendered, their hands shaking in the icy air. The Germans took them prisoner, but with every hour, more Americans appeared, more roadblocks formed, more artillery rained down. It was as if the earth itself was spawning soldiers. Piper knew the truth. This enemy never seemed to run out of men or guns or fuel. And then came Normandy. History would not forget that name. On December 17th, near a crossroads at Bagnes, Piper's men captured more than 100 American prisoners, artillerymen, truck drivers, ordinary soldiers caught. In the tide of battle, what happened next stained the snow red. Shots were fired, and prisoners fell in heaps, executed in the cold field. Some tried to run, others played dead beneath the bodies of their comrades. The massacre at Normandy became one of the darkest. Stains on Piper's record, a war crime that would echo long after the guns went silent. For Piper, it was a moment that bound his name to cruelty. For the Americans, it was a rallying cry. News spread quickly, hardening their resolve. Now this battle was no longer just about ground or maps. It was about vengeance, justice, and survival. Yet even as blood was spilled, the deeper truth remained. The same. Germany's tanks could not move without fuel. The barrels captured at Hansfeld had given Piper momentum, but momentum cannot outlast mathematics. Every mile chewed through more gasoline, and there were no endless convoys waiting for him. Only the Americans had that. His mission reached the Meuse was slipping further away with each skirmish, each delay. And behind him, American engineers blew bridges, cut roads, and clogged every path with resistance. Even when German tanks pushed forward, their supply lines withered. Fuel trucks could not keep up. Ammunition wagons stalled. The forest swallowed whole units that ran dry and had to be abandoned. The irony weighed heavily. In that frozen land, Piper had seen both sides of the war's truth. He had seen how his men cheered over barrels of stolen fuel as if God himself had blessed them. And he had seen how casually the Americans had abandoned it, as if it were scraps. At a feast, he had seen both desperation and abundance, both starvation and plenty, pressed together in one moment of history. It was more than a battle. It was a revelation. As Christmas drew near, the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes. The Germans pushed deep in some places, creating terror and confusion, but the Americans held on. Bastogne became a symbol, its defenders surrounded but unyielding. Everywhere, supply trucks roared to the front, carrying food, ammunition, and fuel over roads choked with snow. And when the skies cleared, the roar of American bombers and fighters filled the heavens. Raining destruction on German columns stalled for lack of gasoline. Piper's Kampfrupp, once the tip of the spear, now crawled through villages, searching desperately for more fuel, more time, more miracles. But miracles ran out. By the end of December, Piper's force was surrounded. His tanks, once symbols of terror, now sat motionless, their engines cold, their crews exhausted. The proud column had been reduced to a handful of men trudging through the woods on foot, abandoning steel beasts worth millions, because there was no gasoline to move them another inch. That was how the mighty spearhead ended, not in victory, but in silence, in snow, in exhaustion. And through it all, Piper carried the memory of Hansfeld. The day he found 50,000 gallons of fuel, and knew in his heart that it meant nothing. For what he saw there was not hope, but proof. Proof that Germany was fighting an enemy too vast to overcome. Proof that all the courage in the world could not match the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the refineries of America's endless land. Proof that this war was not a contest, but a funeral march, one he had been ordered to lead. The Ardennes in late December was a graveyard of broken machines. Snow fell heavy over abandoned German tanks, their blackened hulks frozen in place, engines dead, their crews long gone. The forest trails were littered with wreckage half-tracks, burned to twisted frames, trucks turned into smoking skeletons, and Panther tanks left like stranded giants, their fuel tanks bone dry. Villagers crept out after battles, staring at the once mighty machines as if they were monuments to hubris, steel reminders of dreams that had died in the snow. And among them all, none symbolized that failure more than the spearhead of Joachim. Piper, what had begun as the sharp edge of Hitler's final gamble, now lay dulled and broken. Piper had driven his Kampfrupp deep into American lines, but each mile had been paid in gasoline he could not replace. The barrels of Hansfeld had kept him moving, but not enough. By Christmas, he had been cut off, encircled, and driven into the tiny Belgian village of La Gleize. There, his once proud column of over 100 armored vehicles had dwindled to less than a shadow. Inside La Gleize, the villagers huddled in cellars while the Germans dug in. Tanks were positioned at crossroads, their turrets peeking out like watchful beasts. Soldiers scavenged for food, breaking into barns for hay and livestock. But the heart of the matter was always fuel. There was none left. The Panthers and Tigers stood silent, their massive engines useless without the lifeblood of gasoline. Crews sat in their steel coffins, hands numb from cold, knowing they were trapped. The Americans closed in, artillery shaking the ground, shells pounding the village. Piper's men fought fiercely, firing every round they had, trying to buy time. But Piper himself knew what the end would look like. He had seen it at Hansfeld, and he saw it again here. The German war machine was starving to death. No fuel, no hope. On December 23rd, Piper made his decision. He gathered his officers in the cold, dim-lit rooms of a farmhouse. Outside, American shells crashed closer, glass shattering in the windows. His voice was sharp, urgent. They could not hold La Gleize any longer. They could not save the tanks, the artillery, the half-tracks. All of it had to be left behind. What remained of his Kampfrupp would break out on foot, slipping through the forests like hunted wolves. The order was bitter. For men who had lived and fought in their tanks, abandoning them was like abandoning their very soul. But the choice was clear. Leave the steel or die inside it. That night, under cover of darkness, Piper and about 800 survivors slipped into the woods. Behind them, they left more than 100 armored vehicles, hundreds of trucks, thousands of weapons. La Gleize became a cemetery of machines, frozen in place as though time itself had stopped them. For the villagers who emerged later, it was a surreal side streets, jammed with the silent hulks of tigers and panthers, weapons of terror now reduced to statues of defeat. Even today, one of those tiger tanks still stands in La Gleize, a monument to the futility of that desperate gamble. The march through the woods was merciless. Snow reached up to their knees, the temperature biting at every exposed finger and toe. American patrols hunted them, artillery thundered in the distance, and hunger gnawed at their bellies. Soldiers staggered in silence, their breath rising, like ghosts in the dark forest. Some collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind. Others were captured by American units, sweeping the area. Only a fraction made it back to German lines. Piper himself returned with little more than the clothes on his back, his once feared Kampfrupp destroyed. But the truth of that destruction went far beyond one column. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last hope, his roll of the dice. For a few days, it had shocked the world. American units had been surprised, overrun, captured. Headlines blared of a massive German counterattack. But the deeper current was never in doubt. The Germans were burning fuel they could not replace, while the Americans were bringing up convoys by the mile. For every gallon Piper's men stole at Hansfeld, the Americans were pouring millions more into their armies. For every tank the Germans lost, the Americans rolled out 10 more from factories across the ocean. The contrast could not have been more brutal. Germany had to plan an entire offensive around the hope of capturing enemy fuel. The United States could afford to leave barrels behind in villages, abandon depots, and still move forward without hesitation. The American army was a machine of abundance, its strength measured not only in courage but in supply. And the German army, once the terror of Europe, was now reduced to scavengers, praying for miracles that never came. Piper himself, hardened and ruthless as he was, later admitted the truth. Finding that depot at Hansfeld had not been a gift. It had been a curse. For in that moment, staring at the sheer volume of fuel casually left behind by the Americans, he realized the full hopelessness of Germany's fight. In his words, it was like looking at our own funeral. Those barrels were not salvation. They were a mirror showing how impossibly outmatched his nation had become. The Ardennes offensive collapsed in January 1945. The German dream of splitting. The Allies turned to ashes. What remained of their armored forces limped back across the Rhine, crippled and broken. Hitler had gambled everything on this throw of the dice, and he had lost. The Reich was doomed. Within months, Soviet armies would crash into Berlin from the east, while American and British forces rolled across the west. The war that had begun with German tanks racing across borders now ended with them rusting in the snow, engines silent for lack of fuel. And for Americans back home, this story carried a message that reached beyond battlefields. It was not only the bravery of soldiers at Bastogne or the fury unleashed after Normandy that brought victory. It was the endless, grinding power of production, the rivers of fuel, the factories, the convoys, the machine that never stopped. It was the knowledge that America could fight not just battles, but wars of attrition, wars of numbers, wars where supply was as decisive as courage. That is what Piper saw at Hansfeld. That is why 50,000 gallons of fuel meant more than barrels of gasoline. It was the proof of America's triumph, the moment when a German colonel realized the truth his leaders could never admit, that the war was already lost, written in numbers too vast to deny. The war did not end in the Ardennes, but in many ways, its end was written there. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last throw, a desperate gamble of steel and blood. When it failed, there was nothing left but retreat and ruin. The Reich that had once marched across Europe was now a hollow shell, its armies crumbling, its cities burning, its skies filled with allied planes that owned the day and night. For the men who fought in those frozen forests, the memories never left. American soldiers remembered the shock of the German onslaught, the bitter cold, the desperate defense at Bastogne, and the massacre at Normandy that hardened their hearts. German soldiers remembered the endless hunger, the frozen marshes, the bitter knowledge that they were fighting for a dream already dead. And at the center of those memories stood Joachim Piper, the young SS colonel who had led one of the fiercest armored thrusts of the war and who had discovered, in the snow of Belgium, the full weight of Germany's doom. When Piper returned to German lines after abandoning his tanks at La Glaise, he was no longer leading a proud column of armor. He was the commander of broken men, survivors who had trudged through forests like ghosts. His name was blackened by the massacre of prisoners, his spearhead shattered. The Waffen-SS might still hail him as a fighter, but the truth was clear. His mission had failed. The Reich had failed. And no miracle would come to save it. As the weeks passed, the Allies surged forward. Fuel convoys rolled over repaired bridges, endless trucks carrying the lifeblood of an advancing army. The skies cleared and waves of bombers pounded German cities and railways until there was nothing left but rubble. Soviet armies pressed from the east, their tanks drinking from rivers of fuel captured and supplied. And the German people, once promised a 1,000-year Reich, now starved in bombed-out ruins, waiting for the inevitable. Fuel, or the lack of it, remained at the heart of Germany's collapse. The panzers that had once thundered across Europe now sat abandoned in woods and fields, too precious to move, yet too empty to fight. Factories could still build machines, but they could not fill their tanks. Airfields still had planes, but no fuel for sorties. Even the vaunted jet fighters, the last wonder weapons of the Reich, flew only a handful of missions before sitting idle, useless without gasoline. And while Germany's machines rusted, America's roared ahead, jeeps, Shermans, trucks, bombers, all moving forward in a tide of motion that could not be stopped. This was the lesson Piper had seen with his own eyes at Hansfeld. 50,000 gallons, left behind like scraps, was not just fuel. It was a symbol of abundance, of industrial power, of a nation that could fight a war an ocean away and never run dry. To him, it was a revelation so brutal that he later admitted it was the worst thing that could have happened. For in that moment, he realized that Germany was not fighting a war in the old sense. It was not nation against nation, army against army. It was a nation of scarcity trying to fight a nation of endless supply. It was not a war. It was a funeral. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ash, millions dead, its armies surrendered or destroyed. Piper himself was captured and put on trial for war crimes, most notoriously the Malmedy massacre. He was sentenced to death, though later his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In the post-war years, he lived in the shadow of that past, a man marked by his crimes and by the collapse of the world he once served. In 1976, decades after the war, he was killed in France when his house was set ablaze by those who had not forgotten what he had done. His story ended in fire, as the story of the Reich had ended in fire. But for Americans, the story that lived on was not his fate. It was the lesson of what had carried their sons to victory. Yes, courage mattered. Yes, sacrifice and bravery and the snow mattered. But beneath it all was the machine of supply, the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the convoys crossing the Atlantic, the fuel depots that could be abandoned without worry. It was the knowledge that America's strength was not only in its soldiers, but in its ability to feed them, clothe them, arm them, fuel them, and never stop. That was the true weapon of the war. Older veterans would tell their children and grandchildren the same truth in simpler words. We had more of everything. That's how we won. In Europe's frozen forests, German soldiers begged for gasoline, while American soldiers drove trucks filled with it. In the end, that difference decided the fate of nations. So when we look back on the Battle of the Bulge and the story of Joachim Piper finding those barrels at Hansfeld, it is more than just a detail of war. It is a window into the truth of the 20th century. A young colonel, hardened by years of fighting, came face to face with the overwhelming reality of American power, not on a battlefield, not in a clash of tanks, but in a quiet Belgian village where 50,000 gallons of fuel lay waiting, casually left behind. That sight told him more than any speech or report could. It told him that Germany was doomed, and that America's victory was only a matter of time. And for Americans today, remembering that moment is not only about history. It is about understanding what made the nation strong. Not just courage in battle, but the ability to support that courage with abundance, with planning, with logistics that could stretch across oceans. That is what gave America the edge. That is what turned the tide. That is what won the war. The snow of the Ardennes has long since melted. The forests are quiet now, the villages rebuilt. But the story lingers, as all great lessons linger. In the silence of Hansfeld, in the frozen wreckage of La Glaise, in the memories of soldiers who lived through it, we hear the echo of that truth. Wars are not won by dreams, or even by bravery alone. They are won by those who can fight today, tomorrow, and every day after, without running dry. And in December 1944, a German colonel discovered that truth the hard way, staring at barrels of American gasoline and seeing not salvation, but the shadow of Germany's defeat.